Welcome. I'm very excited to talk about how trees respond to seasonal changes during a long-term drought. The question we will be talking about today, we'll be looking at what's going on with the capacity of trees to respond to summer monsoon rainfall during the current mega drought. And the short answer to this question is that the trees seem less effective in recording summer variability during this long-term drought. So let me share some background first. I think many of you have heard by now that since 2000, a megadrought has persisted over the western US.
A megadrought is choking the western and southwestern regions of the U.S. It's the worst drought in over 1,000 years in this country. This week, local officials in Southern California started restricting water use.
And this is coming from a recent study led by Park Williams and colleagues showing that this drought is the most severe in the region over the last 1,200 years. This current megadrought is not only characterized by precipitation deficit, but is also combined with extreme temperatures and very low relative humidity, which is translated into more water demand from the atmosphere, as the map shows. These conditions during the megadrought have amplified the risk of mass tree mortality, putting this forest in a very complicated situation. However, Brandon Strange will show during the Ecophysiology symposium next Thursday that the monsoon rains can help this forest on a very important way by providing moisture and water resources during and after the spring conditions get very dry. The North American monsoon can rain or can deliver up to 60% of the annual precipitation during July-September, interrupting the hyper-arid conditions during May and June. But this percentage of rainfall can decrease to 30 to 40% in the northern edge of the monsoon, making this region a little bit more interesting in terms of tree response. Now, the question presented in this talk is how effectively these trees respond or if they can take full advantage of the summer rains. But let's remember that the mega drought is at play and those trees are constantly under extreme stress before the monsoon arrives. The data we used to address this question was developed using tree rings from 5 sites located at the northern edge of the monsoon region, as the map shows, and at each site we measured the stable carbon isotopes on 3 different tree ring sections from the 1900s to the 2018. This way we could analyze the beginning of the growing season, the middle part of the growing season, and the late part of the growing season throughout the whole period of analysis. Using the carbon isotopes, we estimated the intrinsic water use efficiency, but as the CO2 concentrations influenced the water use efficiency, it was corrected using a new modification of the model Farquhar et al. Published in 2016 in Global Change Biology. And by the way, all the references are linked in the description below, so you can check those out later. The way we get to the intrinsic water use efficiency from the measurements of carbon isotopes is based on isotopic theory and the mechanisms affecting the CO2 concentrations inside the needles of these pines. So in nature, we can find only 2 different stable carbon isotopes, the abundant C12 and the rare one C13. Thus, the CO2 in the atmosphere contains a known and measurable carbon isotopic ratio, which is going to be our starting point as a source of CO2 in the plant. So during photosynthesis, CO2 is consumed, synthesizing new sugars, and the concentrations inside the leaf will be lower than the concentrations outside the atmosphere. This CO2 consumption always produces this pressure gradient of CO2 driving the flux inside the plant. So during CO2 diffusion inside the plant, there's an isotopic effect followed by an additional isotope effect during sugar synthesis. However, if the environmental conditions are dry, the plant will close the stomata, avoiding water loss, but also compromising the CO2 influx and minimizing the isotopic effect during sugar synthesis, so which gives much more chances to C13 to be fixed into the sugars. So variations in isotopic ratios are directly related to CO2 concentrations inside the leaf, which mainly driven by stomatal activity and photosynthetic rate. Then, intrinsic water use efficiency, which is the ratio between carbon assimilation and stomatal conductance, depends on the differences between CO2 outside the leaf and inside the leaf, which can be basically derived using carbon isotopes fixed on the wood. Moving on, after those trees collected all this water use efficiency data for more than a century, we can observe in the x-axis in the figure the extent from 1900 to 2018. And on the y-axis, we can observe the variations in intrinsic water use efficiency recorded and integrated in these tree rings. Here, I wanted to point out that the positive trend over time, as mentioned before, is expected with the red line, shows that the increasing atmospheric CO2 concentrations have affected the intrinsic water use efficiency. However, if we correct that CO2 trend, we still observe an increasing trend over the last 20 to 30 years, most likely due to stomatal regulation during or due to the megadrought. Now, when we compare the variability among sites over time, we can observe that the 5 sites in this area are more in sync. In the y-axis, the correlation among sites using the intrinsic water use efficiency chronologies shows that before the 80s, the correlation among sites was not significant for most of the record. However, after the 80s, we see an increase in correlation among sites, indicating that the limiting factor among sites could be the same or actually more intense, which is supported with the fact that annual growth is declining while the intrinsic water use efficiency goes up. Thus, we have less carbon assimilation in the system. This increasing correlation among sites is evident also in the lightwood. Now, we need to be careful with this because this is not necessarily meaning that the summer growth is more responsive to summer conditions, as we will see in the following slides. Having said that, adding to the question whether trees effectively use summer rains during the megadrought, don't miss Kinsey-Bailey's talk about water use and oxygen isotopes during our Ecophysiology symposium next Thursday. So moving on to the question, where we wanted to compare the relationship between seasons, and in this figure here, we observe that the correlations between winter versus summer precipitation is independent. The correlation between those two are independent, where the y-axis shows the correlation coefficient between winter and summer precipitation. This suggests the hypothesis that the earlywood and latewood sections should be independent as well, because those tree ring sections are formed during different conditions throughout the growing season. So let's see if this hypothesis holds. When we compare the earlywood chronologies with the latewood chronologies using a running correlation analysis, we can observe that the relationship between both sections is not very stable over time. However, we do see some sort of pattern among sites during the last decades. This pattern shows that the relationship between earlywood and latewood has been increasing over the last decades. And this results suggest that those forests cannot record and express the summer conditions due to the increasing stress during the megadrought, plus the extra stress that every single hyper-arid period every year before the monsoon arrives. So, in conclusion, this response is a form of cross-seasonal physiological drought resistance that basically prevents trees to use local resources, occurs at a large geographic scale, and restricts forest productivity. And this type of response is likely to control climate-driven shifts like forest distribution, doing more mortality and restricting regeneration, and reduce forest services. So with that, I want to thank you for watching, and I will be happy to answer some questions on the Q&A round.